It was the year 1347. In a small port town on the southern coast of Europe, something strange was happening. The sun still shone, birds still sang, and ships still sailed across the sea. But behind the walls of the towns and cities, something dark had begun to stir. People were afraid. Afraid of something they could not see, could not stop, and could not understand. It all began with a ship. One morning, a trading ship docked at the port of Messina in Sicily. The ship had come from the east, carrying silk, spices, and other treasures from distant lands. But it also carried something far more deadly. As the ship dropped anchor, people on the docks noticed something strange. Sailors lay slumped over on the deck. Some were dead, others were dying. Their skin was pale, their eyes hollow, and their bodies covered in dark, oozing boils. The town officials, frightened by the sight, ordered the ship to leave immediately. But it was already too late. A silent killer had arrived. No one in Messina knew what to call it. Some whispered that it was a punishment from God. Others believed it was caused by bad air or poison in the water. But no one could have imagined the truth. The Black Death, one of the deadliest plagues in human history, had reached Europe. In just a few days, the disease spread through the streets like wildfire. It moved from person to person, house to house. A single cough, a touch, or even the air could pass it on. People woke up healthy and died before sunset. Children, parents, priests, and even nobles fell sick. No one was safe. As the plague spread through Messina, panic began to rise. Families locked themselves inside their homes. Streets once filled with laughter and music turned silent. Churches rang their bells for the dead so often that the sound became a background noise to daily life. There were so many funerals that graves became too full. The stench of death filled the air. And then it spread further. Travelers and traders unknowingly carried the plague to other cities, Genoa, Venice, Florence, and beyond. With every ship, every cart, and every footstep, the disease followed. It did not care about borders, kings, or wealth. Rich or poor, old or young, it took them all. But what exactly was this terrible sickness? It began with a fever, a burning heat that left the body shaking and weak. Then came the swellings, large black lumps that appeared under the arms, on the neck, or in the groin. These lumps were painful and often burst, oozing pus and blood. The skin would turn dark purple or black, which is why people began to call it the Black Death. After the swellings came coughing, vomiting, and in many cases madness. Then came death. And it came fast. In some cities, entire neighborhoods disappeared in a week. Doctors could do nothing. Most were too afraid to even see patients. Priests stopped visiting the sick. Friends abandoned friends. Even families left their loved ones to die alone. It was a time of fear, loneliness, and hopelessness. But how did it begin? Far away, across mountains and deserts, in the grasslands of Central Asia, the plague had been quietly spreading for years. It lived in fleas that fed on rats, and rats were everywhere, in homes, markets, and on ships. As trade grew between Europe and the East, rats and fleas traveled together with goods and people. Slowly, unknowingly, they carried the deadly disease across continents. Some say it began in China, where records mention a strange sickness killing thousands. From there, it spread along the Silk Road, the famous trade route that connected East and West. It moved with merchants, soldiers, and caravans, finally reaching the Black Sea. From there, it boarded ships heading for Europe. One story tells of a battle in a town called Kaffa, where a Mongol army, already dying from the plague, catapulted infected corpses over the city walls, hoping to spread the disease to their enemies. It worked. The people of Kaffa fled, carrying the plague with them to Italy. By the end of 1347, the Black Death had found its way into the heart of Europe. But this was only the beginning. People didn't know how the disease spread. They blamed strangers, beggars, lepers, and even the stars. Some believed the Jews had poisoned the wells. In many towns, angry mobs attacked Jewish communities, burning homes and killing people. It was a time of chaos, not just from the plague, but from human fear and hatred. Doctors tried everything. They wore long robes and strange beaked masks filled with herbs, hoping to block the bad air. They used leeches, burnt incense, and bled patients. None of it worked. The death toll kept rising. In some places, people turned to prayer. In others, they danced wildly in the streets, hoping to chase away the sickness. A group called the Flagellants marched from town to town, whipping themselves in public as a way to beg for God's forgiveness. Still, the plague showed no mercy. By the time the first year ended, millions were already dead. This was more than a sickness. It was a nightmare, and it was far from over. By the spring of 1348, the Black Death had spread far beyond Italy. Like a shadow moving across a map, the disease traveled north into France, west into Spain, and deep into the heart of Europe. It crossed rivers, mountains, and borders, as if nothing could stop it. In France, the cities of Marseille and Avignon were among the first to fall. Priests and monks who had once offered comfort and prayers were now dying just as quickly as the poor and the sick. In Avignon, where the Pope lived at the time, panic filled the streets. The Pope, terrified of the plague, locked himself inside a room with thick walls and fires, constantly burning to keep out the bad air. It was a desperate attempt to stay safe. Meanwhile, in Spain, entire towns emptied in a matter of weeks. Farmers abandoned their fields, merchants closed their shops, children wandered the roads, crying for parents who were already dead. There were not enough people left to bury the dead. In many places, bodies were simply thrown into large pits and covered with dirt. The plague was not just killing people. It was destroying the way people lived. In England, news of the deadly sickness arrived with fear. At first, the people hoped the sea would protect them, but ships soon docked at ports like Bristol and London, carrying more than just goods. They carried death. The first cases in England appeared in the summer of 1348. Within days, people in Bristol began to die. The illness followed the same cruel pattern: fever, swelling, coughing, bleeding, death. London, the capital, was next. It was one of the largest cities in Europe, with narrow streets, dirty water, and crowded homes. Perfect conditions for the disease to spread. In London, thousands died each week. The city ran out of space for graves. A large field called East Smithfield was turned into a mass burial ground. Workers dug deep trenches and stacked the bodies, one on top of the other. Priests read short prayers over each row before covering them with dirt. The smell was unbearable. People who could afford to leave the city ran to the countryside. But even the countryside was not safe. The plague followed them. Small villages that had once been peaceful and quiet now reigned with the sound of coughing, crying, and the tolling of church bells. Fear ruled every corner of life. People began to avoid each other. Markets closed. Schools shut down. Marriages were canceled. Even funerals became rare. Many people died alone in their homes. No one dared to enter a house once someone inside had fallen ill. In one small English village,
the people made a brave decision. The village was called Eyam. When the plague arrived, the villagers gathered and chose to quarantine themselves to stop the disease from spreading to nearby towns. They knew this meant death for many of them, but they did it anyway. Over half the village died, but their sacrifice saved others. Stories like this were rare, but they show that even in the darkest times, some people chose courage over fear. But most of Europe was in chaos. In the German lands, the fear turned to hatred. People were desperate for someone to blame. Many turned against Jewish communities,
in a single
accusing
day.
them of poisoning wells.
Slowly,
These lies
unevenly
led
across
to
Europe.
terrible violence.
In some cities,
in city after
it
city,
disappeared within
Jewish
months.
people were burned
In
alive
others, it
or
lingered
forced
for
to
over
flee.
a year.
Entire
And when it
communities
finally
were
left,
destroyed,
it
not
did
by
not
the
bring
plague,
peace.
but by the
It left
madness it
behind
caused.
something else.
The same happened in
Silence.
parts of Switzerland
Europe had
and
become
France.
a land of empty houses,
No one was
quiet
safe.
fields, and
Not
broken
from the
families.
disease, and not
In some
from people's
villages,
fear.
only a handful of people
By the year
survived.
1349,
In others,
the Black
no
Death
one was
had
left
reached
at all.
its peak.
Once busy
Historians
roads were
believe
quiet,
that in just a few
churches,
years,
once
over
filled with people
25
singing
million
hymns,
people died in
stood
Europe.
empty.
That was
Town
almost
squares were
one
no
out of
longer
every three
noisy
people.
with markets and music.
Some cities lost
It was
half
as
their
if the whole
population.
world had paused.
Some villages disappeared
The survivors
completely,
were left to rebuild,
never to be rebuilt.
not just their towns and homes,
The streets were
but their
silent.
lives.
The fields
They
were
walked
empty.
through streets where friends
world
once
had
lived,
changed.
only to find locked doors.
People began
and
to
silence.
ask deep questions.
They looked out across fields
Why had God
that used to
allowed
belong
this?
to their neighbors.
Was this the end
They
of the
sat
world?
in churches where
Would
whole
life
families
ever go
had
back
once
to
prayed.
normal?
The
Many
memories
turned
of
away
the
from the
dead
church,
were
feeling
everywhere.
that God had abandoned them.
But time did not stop.
Others became more
And
religious than
slowly,
ever,
life began
hoping
to
to
return.
find meaning in the
In
suffering.
the countryside,
The
birds
balance
returned
of power
to the trees.
between kings,
Crops
churches,
began to grow
and people
again.
started
Children
to
who
shift.
had survived grew taller,
At the same time,
stronger.
the few who
People
survived
began to
found
gather
themselves
again.
in a strange
Although
new
they
world.
still looked over their shoulders
With so many
fear.
dead, there
Was
were
the
fewer
plague
workers.
truly gone?
Farmers
Or would it
demanded
come
better
back?
pay. Servants
one knew for
became
sure.
important.
Still,
For the first
people
time,
had no
poor
choice
people
but
had
to
a
carry
chance
on.
to rise in society.
And because so many had
The
died,
world was not
the
just
survivors
wounded.
now lived in
It
a
was being
changed
remade.
world. Before the
But the
plague,
Black Death
many
was
people
not
were
yet
poor
finished.
farmers or
By
laborers
1350,
who worked for lords
it had
and
spread
kings.
into Scandinavia
They had little
and
power.
Eastern Europe.
But now,
Ships
with
carried it
fewer
across the
workers,
sea to
their
Ireland
labor
and Scotland.
became valuable.
Even remote mountain
Lords,
villages
desperate
were
to keep
touched
their
by its
land
reach.
running, offered
In the
higher
cold
pay.
north, some
Farmers
hoped the
asked
weather
for
would
better
stop the
treatment.
disease.
And for the first
didn't.
time, many of them
The
got
plague
it.
came in waves.
The balance of
Even
power
after it seemed to
began
vanish,
shift.
it returned
In
again
England,
years later.
this new demand for
continued
fairness
to
led to
haunt
unrest.
Europe for centuries.
In 1381, about
the
30
first
years
wave,
after the first
between
wave of the Black Death,
1347
poor
and
workers rose up
1351
in what became
was
known
the
as
worst.
the Peasants' Revolt.
People who
They
survived that
marched
time
to
would
London,
never
demanding
forget it.
better wages
Children
and more
grew
freedom.
up without parents.
Though the revolt was crushed,
Towns held memories
the
of whole
ideas remained.
neighborhoods lost.
The world would never
Artists
fully
began
go
to
back
paint
to the way
images
it
of
was
death.
before the plague.
Writers wrote
Across
poems
Europe,
about the shortness
changes
of life.
were happening. With
One
so
famous
many
line from
church
this
leaders
time said,
dead, new
"Death is
people
always
rose to fill
behind
their
you,
places.
no matter where
Some
you
were
go."
wise and kind,
And
others
yet,
were not.
Life did go
The
on.
trust people once had
Somehow,
in the church
in the
had
middle
been
of
shaken.
the worst disaster
Many
in
had
human
prayed
memory,
for the plague to stop,
people
but it
still
hadn't.
lived.
Some
They
began
married,
to ask questions.
they had children.
Why had God
they
allowed
told
so
stories.
much suffering?
And those
Was it the
stories,
church's fault?
passed down through
Was
the
it the people's
centuries,
sin?
became
Or was
the
there another
history
reason?
we now remember.
These questions would later help
The Black
lead
Death
to big
was
changes
not
in
just a
religion and
sickness.
science.
It was a
In
turning
cities
point
like
in
Florence,
history.
Venice, and
It
Paris,
brought great sorrow,
artists and thinkers
but it
began to
also
reflect
changed the
deeply
world
on life,
forever.
death, and meaning. The Black Death had shown that life could end at any moment.
After the
That
worst
fear,
of the Black
mixed
Death
with
passed,
curiosity,
the world
helped
looked
spark
the
a
same
new
on the
interest in
outside.
learning.
Villages
This would
still
later grow
stood,
into the Renaissance,
churches still rang
a time
their
of great
bells,
art,
and rivers
science,
still
and
flowed.
discovery.
But inside
that was still years
people's
away.
minds and hearts,
For now, the people
everything
focused on
had
survival.
changed.
In places where
Survivors
whole
lived with
families had
questions.
died, their
Why had
homes
so
and
many
lands were
died?
passed on
Why
to
were
distant
some spared
relatives
while others were
or
not?
claimed by lords.
Why had the church,
In some
which
cases,
promised
land was
protection through
simply left
prayer
to
and
nature,
faith,
failed to
Forests grew
stop
over
the
fields.
sickness.
Wolves returned
These
to areas
questions
they
were
hadn't
heavy
lived in
and
centuries.
painful.
People
And when people
whispered
have
that
no
some
clear
towns were
answers,
haunted.
they often look for
Doctors,
someone
embarrassed
to
by
blame.
their failure to stop the
All
plague,
across Europe,
began to
groups
change
of
how they
people were
worked.
blamed for the plague.
A few started to
The
look
most
more closely
targeted
at the
group
human
was
body.
the Jewish community.
Others tried to understand
Even though
sickness
Jewish
in new
people
ways.
also died from the
Though
plague,
medicine was still
rumors
far from
began
modern
to spread
science,
that they had
the
poisoned
seeds had been
wells
planted.
or used black
The plague
magic
had
to
shown
cause
that
the
fear,
sickness.
tradition,
These
and
lies
superstition
spread faster
were
than the
not
disease
enough.
itself.
Something more
Angry
was
mobs
needed.
attacked Jewish homes.
But the scars of the Black
Synagogues
Death
were
were
burned,
not just
and
in the
entire
land
communities were
or in
killed
medicine.
or forced to run.
They were in people's hearts.
In some places, Jewish
a
people
woman
were
named
dragged
Agnes,
from their
who
homes
had lost her
and burned
husband and
alive
3
in
sons in
public
the plague,
squares.
wrote in her
This
diary,
violence came not from
I speak
truth,
to the walls,
but from fear,
for they are all I
hate,
have
and
left.
ignorance.
Her words captured
Some
the
rulers
sorrow
tried
of
to protect
millions.
the Jews.
A young
Others
boy
joined
named
in
Thomas,
the attacks.
the only survivor
In many
his
cases,
family,
local leaders
was
who were
taken in by a
supposed to
kind
keep peace
priest.
looked the
He
other
grew
way.
up to be a writer
Many
and wrote
Jewish people
stories that
fled to
helped
Eastern
others
Europe,
understand
where they found
what the world
safety
had
in
gone
places
through.
like Poland.
In towns
But
and
the wounds
villages,
of that
people
time
painted
stayed with their
images of
communities for
skeletons dancing with the
centuries.
living. These were called
The Black
Dance of
Death
Death
didn't just
paintings.
hurt people with sickness.
They reminded people
It hurt
that death
society
came for everyone,
with fear and
rich
division.
or poor, young or
Other
old.
groups were blamed too.
Songs changed too.
Lepers, people with
Many were
skin
filled with
diseases, were
sadness
chased from towns.
Others had dark
Foreign
humor,
travelers were
laughing
turned
at
away.
death, because
Even
that was
poor
the only
beggars
way
were
to
accused
face
of
it.
spreading the disease
People
on
began to
purpose.
see life differently.
People
Some
searched
became
the
very
skies
careful,
for signs.
living
They
quietly
believed
and praying
comets,
every day.
strange stars,
Others became
or red
wild,
clouds,
drinking
God
and
was
celebrating,
angry.
as if each day was
Some
their
believed
last.
the plague was punishment
Both were
for
trying to
sins,
cope with the
too much
world that
pride,
no longer felt
greed, or
safe.
fighting.
Children
That
born
belief
after
led
the
to
plague
extreme
asked
actions.
questions their parents
Groups
couldn't
called
answer.
flagellants
Why did
traveled
so
from
many
town
people
to town,
die?
wearing white
Will it
robes
happen
and
again?
whipping themselves with heavy
And sometimes
ropes.
it did.
They believed if
The
they
Black
suffered in
Death did
public,
not just
God
disappear.
would forgive the world.
It
and
returned
stop the
again
plague.
in later years,
Crowds
though never as
gathered to
deadly
watch
as the
them,
first time.
some crying,
Small
some
outbreaks
joining
happened in cities for
But
hundreds
the church
of years.
became worried.
But the first
The
great
flagellants
wave
started
between
to act
1347 and
outside church rules,
1351
and sometimes their
remained
gatherings
the
turned
most
violent.
terrifying.
Eventually,
It was not
they were
just the
banned in
number
many
of people who
places.
died.
Still,
It
their
was the
message
speed,
stayed.
the fear,
People were
and the way
desperate
it
to make
touched
sense of
every
their
part of
suffering.
life. No
not
one who
everyone
lived through
believed
it
the
would
plague was
ever forget
punishment.
it.
A
And
few
yet,
wise
from that
thinkers
dark
began
time
to wonder,
came change.
what if the sickness had a
People
natural
began
cause?
to question old ideas.
Some doctors,
They began to
though
dream of
limited
better
by the
lives.
knowledge of the time,
They valued their
started
time,
studying the
their
body more
families,
closely.
and their health.
They noticed
more
how people who
than
lived
ever
in
before.
clean homes and fresh
In that
air
way,
seemed
the Black
to survive
Death did
more
not just
often.
bring death.
They began
It
to link
forced
the
the
plague
world
to
to
filth,
grow.
rats, and bad smells, though they still didn't understand germs or bacteria. One Italian doctor, Giovanni Boccaccio, wrote that people caught the plague by speaking to the sick or even by touching their clothes. These early ideas were the beginning of a long road toward real medical science. But in the 1300s, science was still small. Most people believed in causes like punishment from God or poisoned air. There was no understanding of how
By
fleas
the
on
end
rats
of
were spreading the
1351,
bacteria
the
that
Black
caused the
Death
disease.
had killed millions.
In cities
The
like
worst was
Paris and
over,
London,
but the
local
memory of
leaders
the
tried
plague stayed
different
in
ways to
every
stop the
town
plague.
and every church,
Some ordered all
and
fires to
every
be put out to
family.
clear the air.
It was the greatest
Others
disaster
ordered them
many would
lit
ever
to
know.
purify it.
But with death
Some
fading,
banned certain
life
foods.
slowly began
Others
to
tried
rise
to keep
again.
strangers out of town.
Europe had changed.
Nothing
Not only had the
worked
number
completely.
of people shrunk, but
A
so
few
had
towns
the power
tried
of
quarantine,
kings,
a word that
bishops,
comes
and
from the
landlords.
Italian quaranta,
Before the plague,
meaning 40.
wealthy landowners had
Ships
ruled
arriving
over
at
large
ports
groups of
were told to
workers.
wait 40
After the
days
plague,
before
there weren't
people
enough
could come
people
ashore.
left to farm the land.
This was one of the few
Villages
ideas
were
that
empty.
helped. It
Fields
slowed the
were
spread,
silent.
at least in some places.
The rich begged people to
Still,
come back and
no
work.
one truly knew
But
how
the
to
workers
stop
had
the disease.
power now, and they knew
Church
it.
leaders, once trusted
Across
for
Europe,
guidance,
poor
now
farmers
seemed
and workers
powerless.
began asking for higher
Monks
pay,
and nuns who cared
better
for the
treatment,
sick
and
had
more
died
rights.
in large
Some
numbers.
landowners agreed.
Some priests
Others
ran away from their
refused.
churches in fear.
Protests and revolts
Others stayed
broke out in
and
England,
died trying to
France,
help.
and other parts
The
of
ones who
Europe.
survived
The
were
old
often
order
young,
was
inexperienced, or unsure what to do.
This shift marked the slow
Because of
beginning
this,
of
the trust
end of
between the
feudalism.
church and the people
the system that
began
had
to
ruled
break.
medieval Europe for centuries.
Some people stopped going going to church.
At the same time,
Others began
cities
praying
began
in
to
private
change.
or looking
Streets
for new
were
kinds of
cleaned,
faith.
Laws were passed
This
to
quiet
improve
change in
public health.
belief would later
Leaders
grow
began
into
thinking
big
differently
movements
about
like the
sickness.
Protestant Reformation,
They created
though
health
that would
boards,
not
watched
happen
for
until
new
over a
diseases,
century
and built
later.
early forms of hospitals.
But even in this dark
Though these
time,
ideas were
there were
simple,
moments of light.
they were the first real
In some
steps
places,
toward modern
communities
medicine.
came together. People
The
helped
arts also
neighbors
came
bury
alive.
the dead.
Before the plague,
Some
much
risked
of the
their
art
lives
and
to
music
care for the
focused on
sick.
religion and strict
In small
rules.
towns, priests
After the
walked
plague,
house to house
artists
with
began to
nothing but a
explore
prayer
human
and a
emotion,
kind word.
joy,
A few
fear,
doctors
beauty,
kept treating patients
sorrow.
even when they knew
Painters
they might
created
die.
images of everyday life.
One story tells
Writers
of a
told
young
stories
widow
of
named
real
Clara
people,
who
not
opened her
just
home to
saints and
orphaned
kings.
children in her town.
The sorrow of
She
the
gave them
plague had
food,
awakened a
cared
deep
for them,
hunger for
and sang
meaning
songs
and
each
beauty.
night to help them sleep.
This
Many
new way
people
of
in her
thinking
town
helped give birth
survived
to the
because of her
Renaissance,
kindness
a time
and
of great
courage.
creativity and discovery.
There were stories like
that would
Clara's
spread
across Europe
in the years to come.
Quiet, unrecorded,
Science
but deeply
too
human.
began to grow. People
Writers
were
and
no
poets
longer
also
satisfied
began
with
to
old
record what
answers.
they had seen.
They wanted to understand
One of the
world
most
around
famous
them.
was Giovanni
Slowly,
Boccaccio,
they began
who
to
wrote The
study
Decameron,
nature,
a book
the
of stories
stars,
told by
the
people
body,
hiding from the
and
plague.
even the air.
His
They
words painted a
observed,
picture of a
they
world
tested,
turned
they
upside down,
questioned.
but also full of
It
humor,
would still take
sadness,
hundreds of years
love,
for
and
doctors to
survival.
fully understand diseases.
In England, a poet
bacteria,
named William
and
Langland
medicine.
wrote of a
But the
land
Black
full of
Death
sorrow,
had started
where
that
death
journey.
is the great equalizer.
In
Even in
small
these
ways
painful
and big
stories,
ways,
people
the
were
world
trying
began
to understand,
rebuild.
to heal,
Some towns
to
offered land
rebuild.
to new settlers.
By the
Others
early
invited skilled
1350s,
workers
the
from
first
far away
great
to
wave of the
restart
Black Death had
industries.
finally begun
Trade
to weaken.
opened again.
Europe
Ships
was
returned to
badly
sea.
wounded.
Markets
Its
filled
fields
with
had
goods.
turned to weeds.
Families had
Its
children.
cities had lost
Bells
half its
rang
people.
again for weddings,
Its faith was
not
shaken.
funerals.
Its leaders confused.
People didn't forget what had
but
happened.
its people,
but they didn't
those
let
who
it
were
stop
left,
them.
were still
In the
alive.
countryside, the
And
forest
that
had
meant
grown thick
there
during
was
the
still
years of
hope.
death. Now, farmers cleared land again. New villages were built. In cities, old buildings were repaired, walls were painted, shops opened their doors. Hope returned, but it was a different kind of hope, one shaped by pain, fear, and survival. Many people who lived through the plague saw the world more clearly. They knew how short life could be. They knew how quickly everything could change. That made them stronger. They laughed louder. They worked harder. They loved more deeply. And they never forgot. Generations later, parents told their children about the time when the streets were empty, when everyone wore herbs around their necks, and when the sky seemed dark even on sunny days. Those stories helped keep the memory alive, not just of death, but of endurance. Even today, historians look back at the Black Death not just as a tragedy, but as a turning point, a moment when old systems began to break and new ideas began to grow. A time when people saw both the worst and the best of humanity. It is a reminder that even in the darkest chapters of history, light can return. The plague that killed millions shook the world, but the world did not fall. It changed, it adapted, it survived. And that is the greatest story of all. The end. Don't forget to like, comment, and share.